Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Enid Maud Dinnis, who lived from 1873 to 1942, was an early 20th century Catholic writer and the author of numerous fairy stories. The daughter of an Anglican vicar in the East End of London, she was educated in a Belgian convent and converted to Catholicism in 1897. She made her living as a writer of journalism, verse, and short stories. Upon her father's retirement, she returned to England, and in 1918 she entered the Daughters of the Heart of Mary and later became the Mother Superior of the congregation's Wimbledon House. In this interview, Julia Meszaros discusses the life and short stories of Enid Dinnis. Julia Meszaros is a lecturer in systematic theology at St. Patrick's Pontifical University, Maynooth. She's also interested in the fruitful interplay between theology and literature and, together with Bonnie Lander Johnson at Cambridge, edits Catholic Women Writers, the Catholic University of America Press's first series of fiction. This series recovers the works of the forgotten members of the Catholic Literary Revival by republishing them with long introductions to the author and her work. Julia Meszaros has a particular interest in the theologically rich writings of the English mystic Caryll Houselander and is published widely in her and others. She is the author of Selfless Love and Human Flourishing in Paul Tillich and Iris Murdoch, published by Oxford University Press. The book discussed in this episode is The Complete Short Stories, Volume 1, by Enid Dinnis. And this volume presents 3 of her collections of short stories: God's Fairy Tales, Mystics All, and Once Upon Eternity. Links to the book is available in the show notes of this episode and can also be found in the corresponding webpage. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Julia Meszaros, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
First of all, who was Enid Dinnis?
Yeah, Enid Dinnis was an English convert to Catholicism. She was born in 1873 and lived till 1942. Her father was actually an Anglican vicar and a learned man, but working in an East End London parish. So she grew up around the sort of simple folk that she later wrote about in her stories. She converted to Catholicism in 1897. And around that time began to really dedicate herself to writing. She wrote satirical sketches in Punch and other London periodicals, then spent a time in Belgium, partly to get out of her father's way, for whom her conversion to the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was a little tricky, given that he was part of the Anglican establishment. And then when she returned to London a few years later, she was still deeply immersed in the writers' scene there. She was a regular at Fleet Street salons and a member of the Writers' Club and editor of a journal. But during World War I, it seems from our research, her approach to her writing changed, and she really began to bring her faith into it much more explicitly. She clearly saw an urgency for a kind of writing that was much more explicit about the supernatural. And that was also quite mystical in tone. So it was around 1917 that she began to write the short stories, the fairy stories, and I'll talk more about that she then became quite famous for. Most of these were published in American periodicals that had a really wide readership at the time. And she really wrote dozens, if not perhaps hundreds of them. We haven't yet fully gotten a grasp of her work as a whole, actually, because it has all been forgotten. And the other important thing to say about her is that in 1918, so around that time when her faith and writing came to intensify, she joined the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, of which she actually later became the superior. The Daughters of the Heart of Mary, probably many haven't heard of. They were one of these hidden orders that actually flourished in England and on the continent in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. They were founded around the time or shortly after the French Revolution, when Catholics weren't allowed to actually openly wear or demonstrate any symbols of their faith. So they were a hidden order. The sisters who had joined that order, or actually a congregation, I should say, they wore secular clothes, they lived in regular houses, they did have religious names, but people only they knew their own religious names among themselves, but in public they went by their secular names. And it's really interesting that people like her were drawn to these kinds of orders and congregations. We can only speculate as to why, but it seems there's several reasons. One, it was possibly handy for her writing career because it allowed her to continue to mingle in all those London salons and just with regular writers, and sort of gain ideas like that and inspiration and exchange with others without being put in a box, perhaps. Also, it might have suited her in regards to her father and the sort of delicacies around his Anglican identity. But I would venture to say that more importantly, actually, there is something going on in her work as a whole about the hiddenness of God in the world, in ordinary people, in ordinary lives. So there's something, deeply theological, actually, I think, in her spirit, or it has something to do with her spirituality. I would venture to say she has a spirituality of the hidden. And she very much also, all her stories are about ordinary people with whom she really identified and clearly needed to mingle as well in order to write about them. So for her, I think God is in the ordinary, and we need to train our eyes to actually see him there, to see the supernatural in the natural world. And that's, I think, what her whole religious vocation in many ways is about, and also her writing. So that's kind of summing up Enid Dinnis in 2 minutes, perhaps. But yeah.
As you mentioned, her writing changed toward the end of World War I, a year before her entry into religious life. Yeah. Was her writing focused more on Catholic themes and mysticism? Was that simply due to her growth in the faith, or were there other factors at play?
Yeah. Again, so we have so little records of her, so it's all a little speculative. In fact, in London, I think their house is in Wimbledon, there are still a few surviving sisters of the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, and they're just in the process of actually compiling an Enid Dinnis archive, which I hope to visit sometime soon, once they open it to researchers and perhaps the public. So I don't know exactly, in that I haven't looked at her diaries, say, but I would say that she seems to be part of a wider interest at the time, actually among Catholics, but even beyond, in in restoring a different kind of vision of the world to the one offered by modernity, by the Enlightenment, by the kind of rationalist materialism that came out of that, and that was very much furthered in England by the Industrial Revolution, that obviously really gained ground in the 19th century. So she wrote in the context of an overall interest in the folkloric, as in magic, in fairy stories, in fairies, as a way of, as a kind of antidote to a view of reality that had become overly rationalistic, overly simplistic and materialistic, and that seemed to allow no room for the wonder at the world, for mystery, for things that maybe go beyond what we can see and touch with ease, but that might be just as real and even more real. And I'm sure many of your listeners will know that G.K. Chesterton, for example, who was actually Enid Dinnis's almost exact contemporary. I don't know if they knew each other, but I would venture to say they certainly would have known of each other and of each other's work, given, how relatively small London Catholic circles were, or English Catholic circles. But he himself, of course, had a lot to say about this and wrote about fairies as being in many ways actually more rational than science. Now that's, Chesterton likes to make bold polemical claims, but he argues more specifically that fairy tales are actually able and willing to acknowledge the contingency of reality and the mystery and intention implied in this contingency, and they contain a willingness to submit to this. So Chesterton argued that it's not actually fairy tales that are naive and illusory, but that it's oftentimes our modern realism that is naive and illusory. So I'll give you an example of how he illustrates that. So he says that we see that grass is green, and therefore we think that grass must be green and will always be green. But he says that's actually an overextension of logic. Just because grass is green doesn't mean it has to be green. And in fact, grass could, logically speaking, in principle, be purple. So the fact that it is green suggests to Chesterton that there is actually some kind of intention behind the world, that someone is willing it to be green. So actually the facts of the world, precisely to his mind, and of course this is really just sort of Catholic thinking in its fundamentals, point to a mind and a will that willed the world to be as it is. And he thinks that fairy tales actually acknowledge this better than scientific logic, which always jumps to overly quick and simple conclusions. So in a story like Cinderella, for example, we find a willingness by the various characters to accept certain facts, such as, for example, that she can't go to the ball if she doesn't have the right clothes or whatever, and that, her new appearance changes at midnight. These are all facts that are accepted, but then at the same time, there's a willingness in the story to go with an alteration of these facts as well. So there's both an acceptance of reality, but also a fluid kind of going along with reality. And he thinks that's actually the more rational and the much more open-minded perspective. There's so much more to be said, so I'm really summarizing a lot in few words. But I think that Dinnis is writing in the context of these wider Catholic and indeed even non-Catholic deliberations about modernity, about an overly rationalist and narrow perspective on reality, a reduction of the world to the natural world, a total bracketing out of supernatural, of mystery, of anything divine, and that she's trying to, through her writing, correct that simplistic or reductive worldview.
Have you been able to uncover which authors influenced Dinnis the most?
No, unfortunately not. I really wish I could say more about that. But again, because we there haven't been any, no archives of her work or of her letters and diaries have been established. It is apparently happening. I met someone at a conference last year who knows some of the remaining daughters, and he said that they're at it, and we've made contact with them, but at the minute they're not yet ready to open any of this to the public. And the tragedy is that she, like so many other members of the Catholic literary revival, have just been completely forgotten. I mean, she, like others, were wildly popular in their day and very well known, but have for various reasons just been dismissed in the meantime. So I think it was sort of in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where sort of the canon of Catholic literature was really forged at the universities. that the criteria for who was to go into that canon and who wasn't were very narrowly defined, often along quite political terms. So there was a sort of a search for a maybe very critically minded Catholicism, for a Catholicism that was very optimistic about modernity, especially among women writers. What publishers wanted was perhaps a slightly more critical or even angry Catholicism. Those are often the authors that continue to remain in print.
So after the angry young men of the 1950s, they wanted the angry Catholics during the 1950s.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there are the likes of Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene who sort of made the cut. But that probably has something to do with their perhaps more male style of writing. And I mean, obviously, they're amazing writers, but they often have a much more big scale view or narrative that has certain political implication. I mean, a lot of Greene's characters move in politically charged environments, and there's kind of a socio-political commentary going on. Even Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh is, of course, commenting on the decline of the aristocracy and the shifts brought about by World War II. It's all implicitly there in the picture. Whereas a lot of women, especially the more faith-filled writers, often focused on much more ordinary life settings, to do with just regular, ordinary, simple characters, oftentimes children, mothers, priests as well, but priests working in regular parish communities in London or wherever. Their settings often weren't quite as grand or glamorous. And then in Dinnis's case, the fact that she wrote fairy stories, that was actually belittled by some of the secondary literature. So the few commentaries that we do have on her by scholars or, critics, literary critics, are quite in the second half of the 20th century, are very derogatory and dismissive of the fact that she wrote these, lots and lots of these fairy stories that was considered naive and sort of maybe a little bit didactic.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.